166 BCE. The temple is silent, its treasury empty. Jerusalem has been turned into a fortress against its own people. 20 miles away in the woods of Modi'in, a man named Matthew laments that he should have lived to see his city in ruins. Matthew is descended from an offshoot of the high priesthood, and thus has the authority to one day reconsecrate the temple, but he is not a well man. He calls his 5 sons to his bed, saying, "These are evil times, but you are still priests of the temple." He points to one of his sons. "You will lead the army that shall avenge our nation." And then he dies. The brothers look to their would-be general. He is not the eldest among them, nor the wisest, but he is already a great warrior. His name is Judah Maccabee. When Judah Maccabee took up his father's sword, Jerusalem had been under occupation for about a year, but conflict had been brewing for decades. For most of the Hellenistic period, Judea had been part of Ptolemaic Egypt, but in 195 BCE, the region was conquered by the Seleucid Empire. Whereas the Ptolemies had repeatedly persecuted the Jews, the Seleucid king, Antiochus the Great, welcomed the Jews with open arms, even helping to found new Jewish communities in Asia Minor. And ironically, it was this generosity that opened the rift between the Jews of Judea and those living in diaspora, because the high priests in Jerusalem could accept the Greek language, Greek literature, Greek theater, even Greek-inspired ideas about government and justice. But one thing the priests could not accept was the dreaded gymnasium. No, seriously, this was actually a big problem. See, even back in the classical period, the one thing the Greeks had always known about the Jews was that they practiced circumcision, and as the Greeks performed many athletic feats in the nude, many Jews in Asia Minor began allowing their newborn sons to forego the ancient practice in order to better fit in. This enraged the Jewish priesthood, and all the more because they couldn't do anything about it. And while this wasn't the direct cause of the Maccabean revolt, it did provide the Seleucids a very flimsy justification for the events that unfolded next. In 168, the new Seleucid king, Antiochus Epiphanes, launched an invasion of Egypt, and as his armies approached Alexandria, they were stopped dead in their tracks by a single man standing in the middle of the road, Gaius Pompilius Linus, the Roman ambassador to Egypt. Rome by this time was a big deal. It hadn't yet conquered the Mediterranean, but it was just powerful enough to scare every other Mediterranean country into compliance, and that's what Linus did now, walking up to Antiochus and saying, "Leave Egypt now, or consider yourself at war with the Roman Republic." Antiochus replied, "I'll have to talk to my advisors." Linus grabbed Antiochus and drew a circle around them in the sand with his walking stick. "No," he said, "give me an answer that I can take back to the Senate before you leave this circle." The implication was clear. Silence meant war, and war against Rome meant defeat. So Antiochus relented and led his armies back to Judea. But now Antiochus had a problem, because he'd been relying on the promise of easy Egyptian plunder to pay his army, and now needed an easy source of poorly defended loot. Oh, hey! Isn't the Jewish temple running a surplus because the Shemitah cycle is almost over? In fact, the temple was running a surplus, so they sacked it, along with all of Jerusalem. Now, up to this point, Antiochus had protected Jewish institutions, so he conveniently offered the high priesthood to a potential friendly candidate, one Matthew. Matthew replied in no uncertain terms, "I and my sons and my brethren will obey only the law of our fathers. It is not profitable for us to forsake the law and justice of God." So instead, the temple was abandoned, and the Jewish population was forced to leave Jerusalem so it could be turned into a massive citadel from which Antiochus's men could enforce mandatory idol worship. This also applied to the Jews living in diaspora, but as it turned out, being uncircumcised did not automatically make them enemies of their ancestral homeland. Which brings us back to Judah Maccabee and his brothers, John Gaddi, Simon Tassi, Eleazar Avaran, and Jonathan Aphus. Matthew had already led a few skirmishes against the Seleucid troops, but pretty much everyone agreed that there needed to be some changes. So, you know when Dad refused to fight the enemy on the Sabbath and we lost all of our men? Yeah, we're not doing that anymore. We fight on Saturdays. And remember when Dad killed a fellow Jew for worshipping idols under threat of execution? I think it's fair to say that he was more of a victim than a perpetrator, so no more of that either. And so they went to war. And it went pretty well. The ranks of the Jewish army swelled, and while they weren't ready to take Jerusalem, they were able to force Seleucid troops to leave the city on search and destroy missions where they could be ambushed time and time again. King Antiochus himself was busy in the east, campaigning against the Parthians, and his generals were mostly interested in pursuing personal glory at the expense of their colleagues. So in true kung fu villain fashion, each general took on the Maccabees one at a time. When Apollonius rallied an army of Samaritans, the Jewish army ambushed them at their own base. And when Siron of Damascus marched an overwhelming force of phalanxes to the city of Bet Horon, Judah assured his brothers, "The success of war is not in the multitude of the army, but in the strength that comes from heaven. They come against us with pride, but we fight for our lives and our laws." Ignoring the perfunctory appeals to God's favor, this is classic military theory. The Seleucid Empire wasn't a nation-state in the modern sense. It didn't have a coherent culture or ideology, but was united only in loyalty to whomever had the biggest army. The Jews, meanwhile, were fighting for their homes, their identity, their lives, and they won the battle. Antiochus was furious, and sent word to his chief advisor Lysias, "Send 40,000 infantry, 7,000 cavalry, and all of our elephants to exterminate the Jews." And yet again, instead of working together and steamrolling the Maccabees, the generals split up and tried to be the first to reach Judea. So instead of a 47,000 strong army, the governor of Edom, Gorgias, encamped in the city of Emmaus with just 6,000 men. Gorgias had planned to ambush Judah Maccabee in the dark of night. Instead, it was Judah who ambushed Gorgias, sending them into flight and picking them off as they retreated up the Sharon plain. At this point, Lysias drafted new plans to retake Judea, but they were never carried out, and by failing to send reinforcements, the burden of occupation was placed entirely on the garrison in Jerusalem. Over the next 2 years, the garrison was slowly eaten away by the Jewish insurgency outside the city walls, and by the autumn of 164 BCE, they could no longer defend the city. The Maccabees poured into Jerusalem's gates. Judah and his brothers entered the temple alone, only to find that it had been defiled. The light of the menorah had been extinguished, and the sacrificial altar had been desecrated with the meat of pigs. This would not do. Judah proclaimed himself high priest, cleared out the sanctuary, reignited the menorah, and presided over 7 days of continuous sacrifices. But because sacrifices were work, and work was forbidden on Shabbat, the process lasted 8 days. This is Hanukkah. And I know what you're thinking. What about the miracle of the oil? Well, the miracle of the oil was a midrash, a folk tale that was entered into the historical records centuries later in order to justify the continued celebration of the holiday. The books of the Maccabees, which were the main source for this episode, never became part of the Hebrew Bible, which is the basis for every other Jewish religious holiday. And on top of that, early medieval rabbis were especially anxious about celebrating a holiday that didn't involve God. Hence, oil. And this is usually where the Hanukkah story ends, but the Maccabean revolt is far from over. There are still Seleucid troops in Jerusalem, for crying out loud. And ironically, at the very same time Judah Maccabee was restoring the temple, an actual miracle was taking place 1,000 miles away. Thanks for watching, and special thanks to my patrons on Patreon. If you like this video, you can also donate via Patreon, link below. You can also check out my book, An Armada of Cats Travels in Israel. Otherwise, you can always like, share, and subscribe. I will see you next time.